Hi, this is Steve Platek for Evolution, This View of Life, the magazine that approaches anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. Today we're talking with Robb Wolf, New York Times best-selling author of the Paleo Solution. Robb also has what would be a world-famous blog on paleo nutrition, robbwolf.com. Robb, welcome. Thanks for talking with us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Robb, how did you first become interested in the evolutionary, or what might otherwise be called the ancestral perspective on nutrition and life?
Gosh, I've always been interested in this stuff since a kid, just evolution and dinosaurs. I mean, the whole thing, just a consummate geek. But I was actually very, very sick in the mid-90s, adopted a vegan diet out of some perceptions of health benefits and some other, maybe some kind of moralistic kind of imperatives with it. And I became really, really sick. I developed high blood pressure, bad triglycerides, ulcerative colitis that was so bad that the doctors were recommending a bowel resection. So, and this is, at the ripe old age of about 26. And so I was really, really sick and quite at my wit's end. And then this idea was kind of presented to me about, well, what if you were to consume an ancestral diet, a hunter-gatherer diet? And I literally was in this moment of desperation. I was living in Seattle at the time doing lipid metabolism research. And this idea kind of came through my consciousness. And so I thought about it and I was kind of like, okay, everything I'm eating is grains and legumes. I really wasn't eating dairy at that point because of the vegan thing. But then when you look at the evolution of humans, there's this demarcation, of all of prehistory when we lived as hunter-gatherers and we did not consume grains, legumes, and dairy. And then there was this very clear demarcation when we started domesticating animals, domesticating cereal crops and whatnot. And there was a remarkable change in the way that we lived. And if you get into this kind of nutty evolution thing, that organisms are optimally evolved for the specific biome that they're in. If you kind of buy into that and you actually think that evolution applies to humans, which a lot of people don't, and this is some of the problem that we have in the greater scheme, but if all that stuff kind of makes sense, then what we have is a situation in which we as an organism evolved very, very effectively to fit into a biome as a hunter-gatherer forager for millions of years, 3 million years of pre-human evolution, Neanderthal, Homo erectus, and all the kind of interconnecting lineages there. And then about 200,000 years for Homo sapiens, archaic Homo sapiens up until now, until only, depending on where your ancestry is from, maybe as short as a couple of hundred years ago, if you are of Native American origin, maybe a few thousand years ago or a couple of hundred years ago, if you're Northern European origin, that you lived as a hunter-gatherer, at least your ancestors did, and that there might be some implications for my health. And so I started doing some research on cereal grains and some of the anti-nutrients that cereals use as an anti-predation kind of tactic. Anything that's really tasty in nature, if it doesn't have thorns or horns or poison or something, it gets eaten. And interestingly, grains are the same way. And there are some very potent anti-predation chemicals that are brought to bear on the survival strategy that grains and legumes employ. And not surprisingly, one of the main vectors that they act on is on the gut lining. They attack and damage the gut lining. So when I started piecing all this stuff together, it made sense. And really all I had to do from there was give this ancestral diet a shot. And it involved eating lean meats, fruits, vegetables, roots and tubers, really excluding grains, legumes, and dairy. And the results were shocking. Within a few days, the signs and symptoms of the ulcerative colitis were gone. The high blood pressure resolved, systemic inflammation that I had resolved. And this was so shocking to me, but the more shocking part was that when I talked to my doctors, and I had a long list of them at this point, rheumatologists, GI docs, GPs and all that, when I told them that I felt that it was a dietary change that really affected the benefit in my health and that it might be steeped in this evolutionary perspective, to a person, they kind of shot this idea down. And this was my first kind of eye-opening experience that our physicians have absolutely no steeping in evolutionary biology. Medicine is a subdiscipline of biology. The guiding tenet of biology is evolution via natural selection. But yet we have a bunch of physicians who are operating as if the only analogy I can think of is physicists trying to do what they want to do without statistical mechanics or quantum mechanics.
Right.
I mean, foundational elements of what ties this science together are missing from modern nutritional sciences and medicine. And so that's really how I came to this whole thing.
So it's kind of like a no-duh moment for you, right?
It was kind of, it was like getting hit over the head with a big fish, you know. It was kind of, you know, you would never think about, or it would not be surprising if we took a cow or a horse who is a grazing ungulate animal with multiple house-treated fermentive compartments for breaking down cellulose in their digestive tract. It should not be too surprising that a quantum change in their diet could perhaps be deleterious. Now, we also have to have the caveat there. Different changes in environment or nutrition could potentially be of benefit too. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be deleterious, but if we see a change in evolutionary diet with an organism, and then we see some problems with regards to health, essentially the adaptation to that environment, then it seems a damn good spot to go look, to put on this hat of an evolutionary perspective to go look for a solution.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Let me ask you a question. You mentioned lots of people don't believe in or don't subscribe to evolution, and therefore the idea of the paleo diet or ancestral lifestyle has run into some roadblocks. I mean, here I am in Georgia, you know, smack dab in the Bible Belt, and I run into this constantly. What have your experiences been with that? Because I know you do. I'm in the CrossFit community, and I know you do some seminars in the CrossFit community, and I also know that there's a large religious cohort in the CrossFit community. And you know, what kind of experiences have you run into with that?
Gosh, they've run the gamut. I mean, there are a lot of people who are, you know, we're talking kind of Judeo-Christian kind of background. The interesting thing is people out of a Hindu or Buddhist kind of background, the idea of evolution is actually kind of woven into their worldview. And so it's not really that surprising. Depending on what kind of background the folks have and just their individual scenario, they may be very devoutly Christian, but have absolutely no problem with evolution. Totally makes sense to them. There's no contradictions there. There's no problems. There are other people that are up in arms about the concept enough that they would track you down and shoot you in your home for even talking about the stuff, you know? And so, I mean, it really runs the gamut. For me, looking at the historical elements of this, there's been a long history of kind of a power struggle where the church has kind of laid out some doctrine, and this goes back to like Galileo when he said that the Earth goes around the sun instead of vice versa, and the dude ended up getting put on house arrest and was blocked from publishing his research, you know. And I think that there's just certain areas where there have become these kind of pissing matches back and forth between kind of religious elements and scientific elements. And the unfortunate thing that has happened, I think, because religious elements have kind of suppressed the idea of different scientific advancements being at odds with religious ideas, that there have been some conflict there. But then what it has done is it's incited scientists to then go out and start saying things that, you know, God doesn't exist and stuff like that. And so it starts becoming this kind of tit for tat thing. And you know, science isn't going to prove or disprove the existence of God or spirit. That it's supernatural and is beyond it is beyond the purview of science. Right. In my opinion.
I think many scientists would agree wholeheartedly with you.
And so for me, what I feel like it boils down to this is just a lot of gnashing of teeth and nobody really getting a forward headway. And I don't really see the different worldviews necessarily conflicting with each other, particularly when you just adopt this idea that, you know, that this is a religious belief is a personal belief and something that is supernatural, and that's it, and it's beyond the purview of science, in my opinion. So I've really received huge bracketing in the response. Some people are very, very anti this idea of evolution. Some people are and religious. Some people are religious and they embrace this idea, and then obviously there are people who are kind of, you know, secular humanist or whatever, and it's not really a big issue for them either way. It's interesting, in Europe, they're much more comfortable with both the religiosity and the the science element of this stuff, and there's not the conflict there. This conflict seems to be very hot and heavy in the U.S. Some of the funny stuff that I've had, like we were going after Dr. Oz, popular TV physician, and part of what I was asking him in a Twitter thread was, do you believe that evolution applies to humans? And just asking a question, because it's either kind of a yes or no thing, and if you do believe it applies to humans, then we start getting some stepwise things about what went into the ancestral diet, and there's some stuff from there. Or if you say, no, I don't believe evolution applies to humans, then we really need to ask some questions about you as a scientist, or Dr. Oz as a scientist. And the hilarious thing that happened was that a number of people, CrossFitters in background typically, and Paleo Diet adherents, these folks came in and they said, well, this diet saved my life. This ancestral diet saved my life, but evolution is bunk. And I was just kind of like, you guys are killing me.
Yeah.
No, I've got a battle with like mainstream media and politics and all the rest of that. And then half of the constituency that I've managed to help by just asking them to try an ancestral diet, they don't even believe in the scientific basis that I'm trying to sell this thing to, which the only way that you can paint the academics into a corner is with an epistemological argument. And it's not going to be that creation science is the way to do that. Like that's just not going to win these guys. Yeah. So it's been interesting.
Yeah, I bet. It sounds like it. Yeah, I'm having the same thing down here. I'm considered the local food Nazi, and I battle this all the time. But it's kind of fun. Let me ask you another question. If you had to give somebody kind of the take home, the message to grandma about the paleo or ancestral diet, what would you say? And then also, what would you say about some things? So when I talk to people about paleo diet, and I think you would agree, when you get somebody on the paleo diet, you say maybe start off on an 80-20, maybe work up to a 90-10, and if you're really sick, go 100% all in, which is challenging for most people. I mean, in my household, my wife and I do about a 90-10, and the 10% include things like coffee and alcohol, which are the for me, the number one and the number two questions I get. Well, there was no coffee in the ancestral environment, and there was no alcohol in the. Now alcohol is questionable because of fermented fruit and that sort of thing. But how, what would you give as the take-home message, and what are your thoughts on things like coffee and alcohol?
Oh gosh, this is where I just start going fetal and just running for cover. My deal, and I transitioned out of science and I started running a gym. And I started dealing with the public, and then my blog, I started dealing with people via that scenario. And what I found was that the 80-20 buy-in, what it produced was very, very poor results and a massive kind of spin out and failure. What you're doing is you're taking away virtually everything that people want, bread and pasta and ice cream and all that, but yet you're not limiting things enough that they actually get well and really notice a quantum shift in their health. Okay. And so that's where I started drawing a pretty strong line in the sand. And, it's interesting, Mike Eads, who's a practicing physician and a paleo diet kind of adherent, and he has been for ages. People who are more clinical oriented, I find that they demand a very stringent buy-in. What I've found is that people from an academic background, when they write a book and then the publishing houses get a hold of it, they do what seems like a reasonable thing, which is a slow graded buy-in, which that reasonable slow graded buy-in virtually guarantees failure because we're not addressing food palatability issues and all that sort of stuff. So for me, what I try to do is recommend 100% buy-in, focusing on no grains, no legumes, no dairy. Really try to minimize booze in the first month. Coffee and tea and stuff like that, the stimulants may actually be beneficial in this transition when people are transitioning from a much more carbohydrate-oriented metabolism to a little bit more fat-adapted metabolism. Grains, legumes, and dairy have some opiate-type proteins that are very, very addictive, and so like a little bit of stimulant that you could get from coffee or tea or something like that can be very helpful. Then always the caveat comes up, well, what do I put in my coffee? And, then I'm kind of like, just try to drink the damn stuff black and, just kind of suck it up for a month and do it. I always make a joke that in college, people can do hookers and cocaine for 30 days and it doesn't kill them. You can do this paleo diet for 30 days It won't kill you, but it may dramatically transform your life. Then at the end of that, you can look back at it and in a very kind of libertarian, free market kind of way, look at this thing and say, was this worthwhile to me? Were the sacrifices worth the rewards? And then from there, God love you, do whatever you want to do. But what I've found is there are so many people who are very, very sick, autoimmune diseases, systemic inflammatory diseases, maybe a neurological stuff going on, that they just don't know until they've really done this very stringent buy-in. And then when they do the stringent buy-in, usually they find some sort of a 80 to 90% buy-in. They might have some booze. They can get away with some corn tortillas once a week or something like that. Typically, people find that they are very, very reactive to gluten-containing items from wheat, rye, oats, barley, millet. Like that seems to be definitely like a no man's land to really try to avoid. But after that initial buy-in, people can kind of slide back a little bit and figure out what they can get away with, what the cost-benefit analysis is. And usually they find that they'll do a little red wine, they'll do a little bit of clear alcohol, like I recommend NorCal margaritas, tequila, juice, and soda water. And they're good. You get to socialize, you get to have fun. Like the last thing I want to do with this stuff is make it so religious and stringent that it ends up peeling people out, or it creates this kind of lunatic fringe that they're no fun to be around. I mean, that's not fun on kind of a social level. But this stuff is really, really powerful, and so I kind of push that full tilt buy-in so that you can see what the change is, and then you can make an educated decision about what you want to do with it.
Awesome. I like that approach. And I mean, I think you'll agree that most of the evidence for the paleo diet is this kind of anecdotal evidence that we have from gyms and from people like you and people that are, quote unquote, out there saying do it. And there's even this new Paleo Doctors Network, which I think is absolutely fantastic. We're trying to start a clinical trial on the paleo diet and, really get some experimental evidence. But independent of that, you're talking about lunatic fringes and stuff like that. How would you address questions, because I'm a psychologist and neuroscientist by trade, and I deal with psychology students all the time, when they say, well, you might eat like a caveman, but you can't emulate the caveman experience, right? In other words, everything we eat today is Neolithic. Whether it's a cow that grazes on grass or not, it's a Neolithic animal. So what is your argument for that in terms of, emulation of the paleo or ancestral diet versus what is the alternative name for that, right? Because we're not really eating paleo foods.
Well, what I find usually in those situations, you've got somebody who's kind of a smart-ass know-it-all that dragging their heels, and they just don't want to give it a shot. They're more interested in trying to get into some sort of quasi-philosophical debate about this thing. What we can do is look at the ancestral biomedical environment, and we've got certain characteristics. We had punctuated elements of exposure to exercise and significant amounts of it. We had punctuated exposure to photoperiod. We tended to have lots of sun exposure on our skin during the day. Then that dropped off. We had a very long dark period at night. If we had light on us, it was of a red wavelength, which tends to associate with the porphyrin proteins in our blood in a very different way than blue light does that comes from modern lighting. That has an ability to communicate with the hypothalamus in the brain and can dysregulate insulin signaling, leptin signaling. We have a bunch of different things that we can look at the biomedical environment of our ancestors and understand, okay, why does shift work make us insulin resistant? It's well understood. Centers for Disease Control recognize shift work and lack of sleep as a known carcinogen. Why? Because it's a deviation away from our ancestral biomedical environment. And we are not going to suddenly adapt our way out of that. Like, the only way that we would adapt our way out of that is selection pressure such that people are dying before they can reproduce. And then we suddenly have a group of people that are able to withstand being up working in 7-Elevens all night and stuff like that.
Right.
So when these people bring up these arguments, one, what I know for sure is that they don't know anything about the anthropology. They don't know anything about the evolutionary medicine. And usually what it's a window into is the fact that you have somebody who has a Discovery Channel level of understanding on this topic, and they're just trying to drum up some sort of BS arguments on the thing. Awesome. Because What we're trying to do is look at this from as comprehensive a systems-based approach as we can, and then look at where our modern life is maybe at odds with our ancestral genetics, and then try to do some things to fix that. Why is it that inadequate socialization, inadequate social connectivity is as impactful on health as a 3-pack-a-day smoker?
Right.
Because we evolved in small hunter-gatherer groups, and it's well understood in modern times, if you belong to a religious group, if you have a large extended family, you are much more likely to live an extended age because you are much less stressed than the modern urbanite who not only doesn't know who the neighbors are, but is afraid of the neighbors, right. And you are isolated in your house looking at a TV. That is horrible for your health. You need to ask that question why, and you can't answer that question until you have an evolutionary biology perspective. Because we're talking about a biological process, and if you're trying to answer a biological process without the template of evolution, all that you're going to do is look at a bunch of random studies and you have no cohesive way to string this stuff together. Again, going back to the physics analogy, you had things like the photoelectric effect, in which a photon hits a piece of metal or a semiconductor and breaks electrons loose, and then we start getting electrical flow, or we have the quantum electric effect or quantum mechanic effect, things like light and dark alternating patches when you shine a light through slots and stuff like that. Light looks like it's a particle, it acts like it's a wave. How do we rectify this? What we did is people engineered a theory, quantum mechanics, wave-particle duality, and then it seemed to fit the data, and then from there we've been able to move forward and actually string all this stuff together in a pretty comprehensive manner. Without that understanding, if we still had just Newtonian physics, we would not be able to do GPS satellites. We wouldn't be able to use fiber optic cables to send information via laser light, because we need to understand quantum mechanical effects to be able to adjust just simply for a GPS satellite being at the outer edge of a gravity well and us being at the deep edge of a gravity well. And so without all that stuff, none of our modern technology would work, and we're in a similar situation without an evolutionary steeping. We're trying to do medicine, trying to do psychology and psychiatry without any damn understanding of what we're doing. It's just one study after another study, but yet no way to really gauge the validity or to really hypothesis test it in a rigorous way. Not on the standards of chemistry, physics, and engineering, but as soon as you start bringing evolutionary biology to bear on these questions, we have an opportunity to bring a rigor to the biological sciences that has been missing throughout the whole existence of biological sciences.
Absolutely. And I'd even argue that that's more true in psychology, where psychologists have been constantly coming up with ideas about how children develop and how families develop. And then when you take all that theory from Bob, Joe, and Sally, and you overlay evolutionary theory, all of a sudden it rectifies all of their differences.
Yeah. And without that template to overlay it, it's like a bunch of broken pottery shards in a pile. And if this was another analogy that I've used. If you had a red, a green, and a yellow piece of pottery, and you broke them all and mixed them all together, if you had a picture of what each one of those pottery pieces looked like, and you were not colorblind, it would be some work, but you could piece it all together. But if you have no idea what those pottery pieces originally look like, and you're colorblind and they all look gray, you've got a problem. You're going to have a hell of a fitting that all together. And this is the same thing with an evolutionary template. We can start piecing some of this stuff together in a reasonable way. And again, this is the only way that you're going to bring in rigorous hypothesis testing on par with what you can do in chemistry and physics and engineering and stuff like that.
Right.
We do not have that in the biological sciences. We don't have that in medicine currently. As soon as you bring evolutionary theory to it, then you can actually bring that level of rigor. You can bring statistical mechanics that tie this thing together from top to bottom.
Fantastic. Let me ask you another question. How does the paleo diet, specifically with respect to sort of neurological health and psychological health, what has your experience been with the effects of the paleo diet on psychological well-being or neurological well-being? I mean, I've read some recent articles about IR insulin receptors and Alzheimer's and a number of other disorders, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on it.
I mean, it's been shocking. We found, gosh, this was maybe 5 years ago. There was a woman training at a CrossFit facility with early onset Huntington's disease, very aggressive early onset Huntington's disease, adopted a grain, legume, dairy-free paleo diet, and within about 3 weeks was asymptomatic with the Huntington's disease.
Oh
like a shocking resolution. We found 2 more examples of folks like that, sent all this information to UCLA and UCSD, and they've been tracking these people, and they're putting together a pilot study to try putting these people on a gluten-free paleo diet. We started looking at some of the etiology of what was going on. Obviously, Huntington's disease is this DNA base pair repeat, and you start experiencing severe oxidative damage. And really, at the end of the day, whether we're talking Huntington's or Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, whether it's beta amyloid proteins or whatever's going on, at the end of the day, it's some sort of inflammation that is causing the damage. We have different etiological inputs, but the final problem, the reason why we're getting neurological damage is systemic inflammation. We did a little digging around, and we appear to have found an epidemiological or a epigenetic trigger that is related to the enzyme transglutaminase, which is ubiquitous in the body. It modifies virtually all the proteins in the body. When people develop an autoimmune response to gluten and gluten-like proteins, they have a tendency, because of the homology of the proteins, to produce antibodies that also attack transglutaminase. There's 8 different isoforms of transglutaminase. Isoform 1, I think, is neurological. I forget, like 3 and 5 are dermal. I forget the specifics on that, but this is where we see different epigenetic inputs of a gluten dose potentially causing different types of disease in different people. So certain people who develop antibodies to this transglutaminase with the isoform that is specific to neurological function, they develop neurological disease. And in this case, Huntington's disease likely, we're theorizing, could be asymptomatic without that epigenetic trigger. And so we need to look at what's going on with that. But we've seen ketogenic diets prove to be very, very beneficial in animal models with regards to Huntington's disease. Ketosis has an interesting effect in stabilizing calcium function in the brain and stuff like that. That may have a factor in it, but it may simply be that ketogenic diets, by their very nature, remove grain irritants like proline-rich proteins like in gluten and gliadin and all that stuff, and that you may just be removing the epigenetic trigger. We don't know that, but it's been very, very interesting. And tons, again, anecdotal largely at this point, of people reversing all kinds of autoimmune diseases and whatnot. But we did a 2-day call for people who have had an existent autoimmune disease, adopted a paleo diet, then became asymptomatic, and all this stuff was medically documented. Like looking at blood titers,
right.
bodies, stuff like that. In 2 days, we had over 200 people, a comment that they would like to participate in this study. This is Professor Lauren Cordain's graduate student. Right now, he's working with a data set of 100 people that we have pristine, medical data of well-established autoimmune disease, intervention with the paleo diet, and then subsequent resolution of this autoimmune disease. Now, again, this is a cherry-picked pile of data. There's no selection there. This is basically asking for people who did succeed. We're not asking for all the people that didn't succeed and stuff like that. So there's a lot of unknowns here, but it is damn compelling, because we're talking about things from multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, a whole host of autoimmune diseases that seem to resolve. And the interesting thing with this is that my website and similar websites that really talk about autoimmune disease and this paleo diet intervention, we tend to get better Google ranking than the governmental websites that deal with these diseases.
Right. It's not surprising at all to me. It's not surprising at all to me.
And so there's this crowdsourcing phenomena that's going on where people are comparing notes and they're trying to figure out what does and does not work. And the standard of care going and getting put on methotrexate or something like that for rheumatoid arthritis, it doesn't work. Whereas it looks like some sort of an evolutionary biology approach. Get vitamin D levels up so you mitigate systemic inflammation from an overactive immune system, remove gut irritants, establish a good antioxidant intake from plant and vegetable matter. It's this holistic systems-based approach, but suddenly we start getting some really remarkable improvements in people's health, and then they start sharing that information. So it's not scientifically validated in that we have double-blind, placebo-controlled, crossover studies, et cetera, but we may end up saving the whole population before we prove that this stuff works.
Right.
We may adopt it at a rate that then, 15 years later, scientists prove what is obvious by that point.
Right.
But we'll see on that also.
Yeah, it wouldn't be the first time something like that happened in science. Yeah. That's fantastic. Listen, Rob, I don't want to keep you too much longer. I mean, I think we've touched on a lot. But for our viewers of the magazine, if you could give us like a sentence or two about how they could start to do the paleo diet. And, one of the things that I would like to use this conversation as a springboard for is for people to either communicate with me or you via your blog about the experiences. I know in my CrossFit gym, what we've done is we've had these, and gyms have it all the time, these paleo challenges. And what we see is we see drastic increases in performance that you would never expect. Deadlift going up 250 pounds, miles sprint going down from 9 to 6 minutes. Not to mention people start looking good naked, right? They start getting a six-pack, they start feeling better, sleeping better, being less irritable. So the anecdotal data is out there. But what would be your message, and how can people sort of get involved in some of the studies you're doing? But what would you say, like if somebody said to you, okay, Rob, I have 30 seconds, tell me how to start the paleo diet?
You can do it either the inclusive way or the exclusive way. I kind of like the exclusive way. Remove grains, legumes, and dairy. Avoid liquid foods. And so what you're boiled down to is, meat, fish, fowl, fruits, vegetables, roots, tubers, nuts, seeds. If you are on the heavier side of the spectrum and really need to lose some weight, I would curtail carbohydrate intake until you get leaned out. So stick more protein, fat, and veggies.
So stay away from the fruit, maybe?
I'd stay away from the fruit, stay away from the yams and sweet potatoes. If you're a hard-charging CrossFit athlete, eat lots of yams and sweet potatoes and white potatoes and stuff. The protocol for somebody overweight and obese is going to be different than what we would see in an athlete. And that really shouldn't be surprising, but I can't tell you how often people, mess that one up, and you have a hard-charging CrossFitter that suddenly is tanking because they're eating super low carb and stuff like that.
Right.
So that's the way I would tackle it. If you go to my website, robbwolf.com, I have a free download. Like, you don't even need to buy my book. Everything that you would ever need to know is in the quick start guide, the shopping and food guide, the food matrix. So you don't need to buy the book to do it. It tells you everything. It describes it for weight loss, for athletes, whatever. We've done a little bit of market analysis, and about 60% of the people that buy my book buy it after they use the quick start guide, had success, and then they were so jazzed about the success, they bought the book as basically a thank you. So it's kind of an interesting gig. So, people can try it on and see if it works and just run from there. But people will oftentimes say, I don't know if I could do this. And my counter to this is, have you ever had scrambled eggs and fruit for breakfast? Inevitably, people are like, yeah, okay, I had scrambled eggs and fruit at some point for breakfast. Have you ever had a salad with chicken on it for lunch? Sure. Have you ever had some pork spare ribs with a bunch of grilled veggies and a glass of wine for dinner? Yeah. Okay, then you've eaten thousands of paleo meals.
Right.
Just sometimes you've mixed in some other stuff in the deal. So like you've eaten one paleo meal at one point in your life, so all that you need to do is string more of them together. Do it for 30 days. See how you look, feel, and perform. Track some blood work before, track some blood work afterwards if you want. And it'll be clear as day, and it'll either work for you or it won't. I'm still waiting for the person that it doesn't work for, but as a scientist, I've got to have that caveat in there.
Right.
But then folks can then make the decision: is that level of buy-in good for them, or do they want to modify it? And then it's totally up to them. It's not about a moralistic thing or trying to do this, to the bestest of their ability to ruin their life. It should improve your life, and
right.
It's really not that hard.
Awesome. Rob, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to talk with us for the magazine.
My pleasure.
The vidcast will be up probably in a couple of weeks after we send it through the chains, and I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure, man. Honored to be on. Would love to come back in the future if you ever want me.
Well, I'm going to take you up on that.
Cool.